The next speaker is Susan Schuppli. She's media artist and researcher with the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmith. She holds a Master in Fine Arts from the University of California, San Diego. And in this Center for Research of Architecture in Goldsmith, there's the Forensic Architecture Group, of which Susan is a part. Susan's setting up. I ran into this exposition in Berlin, actually. And I was so impressed by the work that this group, which is a very large group, and Susan is one of the key figures in this group, is doing to see how you can use the technologies that we use in very different ways to reveal truth. Susan.
Thank you. Excellent. So yeah, good afternoon. Let me just have a sip of water. So what I'm going to do is I want to move through quite a lot of visual material to give you a sense of both the collective research project, which is called Forensic Architecture, and it's a project that is based in the Center for Research Architecture, funded by the European Research Council, and I work with the principal of that project, Eyal Weitzman, Francesco Sobergundi, but also a huge team of, well, maybe actually not so big, but we work with our PhD students and our master's students, and of course we also work with local NGOs, Amnesty International, the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, legal organizations like Reprieve, based in the UK, but also ECCHR in Berlin. So we really work with a fairly broad set of skills, all in the sort of pursuit of analysis of human rights violations that happen in very complex spatial situations, and that the project both investigates, produces scientific reports, but very crucially also tries to reflect on both the methodologies that we use, on the context in which we find ourselves, our practices. So it really has it's a very multifaceted project. So yes, of course, investigation and justice and political transformation are at the heart of our project, but that also requires a certain amount of critical self-reflection. So being in an institution or university like Goldsmith is actually a very kind of effective place for a project like this to occur. So I'm just going to walk through signaling some of the key areas and roles that media has come to play in some of the forensic architecture investigations. And then if there's time, I'd like to show a couple of clips of my own artwork where I try and actually look in some way, try and look at some of the kind of questions, perhaps through a bit more of a sort of philosophical lens. So I'll begin. All of our materials you can find on our website. We have ongoing investigations right now into Gaza that we're working with Amnesty International. But I'll begin with this one. This was interesting, and it's run by two of our PhD students, Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pezzani. And this was during the Nato embargo and the hostilities in Libya. And I'm going to be trying and move through these very, very rapidly, so to give you a sense of the kind of scope of the project. But what was interesting in this case, this is migrant boats were pushed into the Mediterranean. This started to happen with increasing happening on a sort of daily basis, and a group of 72 migrants were pushed into a very leaky ship bound for Lampedusa, Italy. Of course, the engine quickly failed. They ran out of food and water. They were able to make a final kind of distress call to their priest in Rome, which gave us a GPS coordinate. But in this case, what Charles and Lorenzo were able to do, they were able to counter the public claims that no nation saw this boat. And in fact, they were able to use the kind of very dense surveillance of the Mediterranean, in particular at this time, to launch to produce an investigation that demonstrated that, in fact, this boat, which eventually drifted, in which 63 people died by the time it reached the coast of North Africa again, had moved under one of the most densely saturated areas of geography in terms of visual surveillance and tracking systems. And we were able to plot the trajectory of that boat using a drift model, using various kinds of technical visualizations. So this was an interesting example where media and a kind of surplus of media was actually the very kind of sort of legal means by which we could launch a counterclaim to say that, in fact, this argument that was raised that, of course, we didn't see this boat in distress. We argued that you could not have seen this boat given the kind of dense media saturation. And this is going currently through the kind of French court. So there's an example where media is used strategically to pursue a kind of human rights claim within a legal context. Other examples where we would use media, and we often use what we call video to space analysis. This was in Berlin. This is the death of a Palestinian protester who was killed by a tear gas canister. And the IDF claimed that they had shot this tear gas canister and it must have bounced off a fence and inadvertently killed Bassem. Well, in fact, we were able to harvest information from the various video cameras that were on the scene, and in one frame we could see the trajectory of the bullet, and we're able to do a kind of technical report that the lawyer working for Bassem, Michael Svard, was able to use to reopen a case that had been closed. So in this case, we were working and triangulating video that was shot by protesters on the scene. And Michael Svard is an activist lawyer with whom we work quite regularly. The organization he works with is called B'Tselem. And in Berlin, the situation that Caroline mentioned, one of the things that Michael said to me when I was interviewing, and it was quite an extraordinary comment that he made, he said that artists are providing lawyers with new legal tools. And I said, well, that's extraordinary because most artists would probably not think of their practice as in quite such instrumental terms, but also working in the service of sort of law. And he goes, no, you have to understand the ways in which we need to be able to tell stories, not only in court, but we need to be able to produce a certain amount of legibility. And human rights conflicts are often extremely kind of complicated. They happen in areas where sometimes there's a real kind of deficit of information. And he was saying, look, artists, and in particular, he was referring to the work that we do in the center and under the Forensic Architecture Project, was really allowing him to narrate stories for the judiciary, but also for the public in a way that was kind of unprecedented. Another example where we actually relied, in this case, very much on mainstream media, and this was the analysis of the use of white phosphorus gas as an airborne munition. And of course, it's a very highly incendiary kind of munition, usually not used thrown from an airplane, normally used on the ground for purposes of illumination, etc. Extremely flammable. And so in this case, we were harvesting information from basically any sort of photographs and video footage that we could find. And what we were trying to do was we were trying to analyze the indiscriminate nature of this munition by literally running parametric modeling and following all of these kind of trajectories that we see through the sort of sky. And we were able to produce a report that was presented in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And that, in fact, was quite effective. The Israelis stopped using that as an airborne munition because they knew that they couldn't actually counter the claim that this was a legally permissible weapon because it was precise. Because, of course, we know that one of the pillars of international law is proportionality and distinction. And you cannot use an indiscriminate weapon legally. And so this is an example where we actually were able to extract information from as I said, sort of very kind of mainstream media to produce the technical report. This is a bit of a different example. These are 2 living death camps that we worked on one Marska in Bosnia-Herzegovina and another one in Staro Sajmište in Belgrade. And in this case, we worked with ground-penetrating radar as well as LiDAR scans. This is not a case that was going into a kind of legal situation. It has to do with very much the admission of Serbia into the European Union requires that it deals with its Holocaust past and produce a form of commemoration. So in the case of Staro Sajmište, there's a series of evictions that are happening now. So people are being cleared from the site in order to commemorate the Second World War. And we said, politically, this is absolutely unacceptable. And so we did quite a bit of work on that site to show the ways in which it was that the people that actually lived there were very much the kind of guardians of the site. I can go into more detail. This is a very complicated investigation. And I could talk about the Bosnia-Herzegovina camp, perhaps in Q&A. Another example where we used, in this case, media in quite a different way. This was work done by Paulo Tavares, who's also one of our PhD students, and an MA student, Daniel Fernandez Pascual. And what they were doing was they were using satellite imagery, specifically to look at, there's particular bands in the spectrum that allow us to read environmental transformations and change. And this was a report that we produced for the trial in Guatemala that's happening against the former dictator Rios Monte. And what was interesting about this work, which is quite different than, say, work that one might want to do on the ground, the violence that was inflicted on the people was being argued that the environmental violence was a factor in the destruction of these people, and there was a charge of genocide has been levied against Rios Monte. But what is very difficult to see in these kinds of ecological systems is when a village is raised over time, and then we have to understand this is a very protracted civil war, but over time, vegetation will grow back quickly, and the crime, if you will disappear. But it doesn't disappear when you actually use the NDVI satellite imagery, and there's a whole repository of that kind of information that one can find in the Landsat archives, which go back to 1972. But you can read environmental transformation through certain kinds of satellite imagery because things grow back at different rates, and therefore they produce a different kind of vegetative kind of index. So we were able to use satellite imagery to show patterns of destruction over an extended period and to show the high degree of intentionality in the perpetration of violence that would otherwise have completely remained kind of literally undercover and invisible if you were actually on the ground. Now this is work that we did in conjunction with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And this is an interactive platform where you can look at drone strikes in northwest Waziristan. So we worked with BIJ's data set, but we looked through their entire data set to look specifically at what kinds of spatial targets and architectural kind of infrastructure was damaged to produce a kind of new picture of armed combat drone use in Fata our rather than simply a data set that focuses on casualties and injuries. And this was actually one of our MA students worked at the Bureau as an intern, and Jacob Burns, and was very instrumental in working on this platform. Now what I would like to do is just show a couple of clips because we produced a series of investigations and visualizations for the UN inquiry into the use of armed drones. I think Ben Emerson was speaking this morning, so he was the special rapporteur for counterterrorism and human rights, and included this material in his report, and we also produced a similar kind of report for Ben. So I'm going to show you clips from two drone strike investigations that give you a sense of the ways in which we're trying to work to generate information. And in the case of Fata, there's quite a radical asymmetry in terms of who has information about what's going on. Of course, there's a lot of signals intelligence. We know there's a lot of drone surveillance, but this is not information that local journalists or researchers like ourselves will ever have access to. We have very little information, in fact. But what the two visualizations that I'm going to show you, they really tried to accentuate the degree to which, despite this enormous deficit of information on the part of a kind of civilian population, there's still much that we can actually learn through this incredible kind of detailed sort of forensic analysis, which is just a very painstaking kind of process. So unfortunately, you're only going to see two very short clips. It's quite interesting to explore the website and to see the kind of range of the methodology that we had to use to produce these, but this will give you a bit of insight.
On the 4th of October 2010, a US drone struck a home in the town of Mir Ali, North Waziristan, in Pakistan, killing 5. One of the surviving witnesses to this attack is a German woman who lived in the house at the time with her 2-year-old boy and husband. Together with forensic architecture, this witness built a digital model of her home, which no longer exists. During a day-long process of computer modeling, the witness slowly reconstructed every architectural element of her house. Placed virtually within the space and time of the attack, the witness was able to recollect and recount the events around the strike. Our meeting took place in Düsseldorf, Germany, on the 21st of May 2013. The witness, who prefers to remain anonymous, is hoping to communicate the realities of life under drones and the experience of surviving a strike in which she also lost her brother-in-law.
So, das war wirklich ein kleines Dorf und da waren ja, Moscheen, viele andere Häuser. Weißt du, dass das Krankenhaus irgendwo hier in der Nähe war, ja. Die Moschee auch ganz nah an uns, irgendwo hier im Umkreis. Aber so den Grundriss hatte ich immer im Kopf gehabt. Ich habe ja auch länger da gelebt, Tag und Nacht. Und hier war auch wieder so eine riesen schwere Eisentür, genau wie auf der anderen Seite. Mhm. Richtig, ja. Ja. Ich will das etwas breiter machen. Okay. Ja, so ist okay. Stopp. Ich erinnere mich gerade. Die Tür war weiter hier und das Fenster war auf der Seite. Okay. Mhm. Jetzt einfach, genau. Kann ich das einmal von oben sehen? Dann kann ich das besser. Ja. Ja.
Hilft diese Visualisierung, um sich mehr daran zu erinnern, was passiert ist vor jetzt knapp 2,5 Jahren?
Also es hat mir schon sehr viel geholfen, muss ich sagen. Mhm. Ohne den Grundriss wäre ich nicht darauf gekommen. Ja.
So, ja, also das sind verschiedene Sachen.
Okay. Das würde ich einfach mal.
Das Bett?
Ja, hatten wir im Hof stehen. Da haben wir uns halt. Mhm. Ja, ich würde es mal weiter an die Tür rücken. Ja, so. Mhm.
Okay. Wann waren Sie denn das erste Mal wieder auf dem Grundstück?
Nach der Beerdigung. Wir sind dann nach der Beerdigung nochmal dahin gefahren, um uns das alles nochmal anzugucken. Aber ich weiß, dass da andere halt so ein bisschen auch aufgeräumt haben. Wir sind hier rein und dann halt ganz langsam durch.
Ja.
Ja.
Was haben Sie denn da gesehen?
Halt hier erstmal so ein riesen schwarzes Loch, wo halt die Rakete eingeschlagen ist. Ich sag's mal ganz einfach, die Männer saßen ja hier und haben ja hier gegessen. Mhm. Die haben wirklich hier drauf. Okay. Innen drin komplett schwarz und die Erhöhung war halt so, das waren so Streifen halt wegen dem, weil das ja dann aufgeplatzt ist, die Rakete. Ja, okay. Ne? Vieles war auch verbrannt, so viele Stoffstücke und auf dem Boden halt die ganzen Metallsplitter von der Rakete.
Und wo lagen die?
Überall verteilt, das kann ich so gar nicht sagen, wirklich überall etwas. Ja. Genauso auch wie mit den Körperstücken von den 3 anderen, ja. Die überall verteilt lagen. Mein Mann hat eine Hand irgendwann gefunden. Okay. Ich habe in dem Ventilator verbrannte Körperstücke gefunden, auch ganz kleine, mit Haaren. Ja, wir haben es deswegen eingesammelt, weil man das halt auch dann mitbestattet hat. Das sollte da nicht einfach so rumliegen. Ich bin dann in meinem Haus reingegangen, um meine Sachen zu holen.
Sind Sie danach nochmal zurückgekehrt oder nie mehr?
Nein, nie mehr.
So this is actually quite an unusual situation because we had access to a survivor from a drone strike. She happens to be a German national, so she was able to leave Pakistan and come to Germany, and her husband is in a German prison now. He has been charged with under the German terror laws, but we met her through her lawyer, who works, Andreas Schuler, who works at the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. That's also the organization that is, Wolfgang Kleck, the director, is also one of Edward Snowden's pro bono team. So, as I said, that's quite an unusual situation to have access to a survivor. In fact, unprecedented. And another thing I might add, it's extremely difficult to speak to women within the context of the drone war. And so that would be another very, I think, unusual facet of this particular investigation. Another investigation from the town of Miran Shah.
Very, very hard to get footage from something that almost no outsider has ever seen.
This is what many Pakistanis call evidence of an American war with their country. Rare images from the remote tribal region of North Waziristan showing destruction after a U.S. drone strike. The attack occurred at 3 a.m. on March 30th in this market area. One missile pierced the ceiling. More demolished 5 nearby shops.
This footage can reveal a great deal beyond what appear to be chaotic images of rubble and ruin.
And this is
Using a collage pieced together from individual video frames extracted from the footage, we try and locate the building within a satellite image of Miran Shah. On the left, a distinct change in the direction of the road is visible. On the right, there is a certain widening of an otherwise narrow road. In order to find this building within the city of Miran Shah, we examine the street morphology that we identified earlier and find a matching road pattern. Next, we undertake a detailed comparison between the satellite image and the news footage. On the left side of the building, we notice a series of beams that fan out in a radial pattern. We locate the same radiating beams at the newly identified location on the satellite image. In addition, both images depict a tower to the left side of the building, near the bend in the road. We can also make out a higher structure on the other side of the street from the tower. These spatial indicators allow us to identify and match the location to the destroyed buildings depicted in the news footage.
Oh, sorry, one last.
We analyze the length of the shadows cast from buildings in order to determine the different volumes of the structure. The length of a shadow is relative to the height of a built structure. Using this information, we built a computer model of the building, before and after the strike. We modeled the shadow cast on different days and at different times of the day, in order to compare it with the shadows visible in the satellite and video images, and to corroborate its volumes. Based upon the assumption that the video was shot soon after the March 30th strike, we were able to approximate the time of day it was recorded by animating shadows as they moved across the surfaces of the model. The MSNBC video footage also depicts other locations. In particular, it also shows the destruction of a still unidentified empty room.
I'm going to move along and just wrap
Our
up.
next task,
This was the, so as I said, what's a little bit perhaps unusual about the work that we do, we also, it's mobilized in a number of different contexts. So of course, legal forums, public advocacy and activist contexts, but also kind of exhibition spaces. So, so pedagogy is also an extremely important aspect of the work that we do. And as a final comment, I might say I would just show a slide The work that I do personally as an artist is in some way to really look at the ways in which media are not simply, media are both opening up the possibility for a kind of transformative politics, but also the ways in which they might be closing that down. So my own practice has been about tracking media artifacts that come out of specific contexts of political violence. We're quite a bit on an anonymous execution video that came out of Sri Lanka in 2009. Also massacre videos that were a very specific one that came out of the context of Izbica, Kosovo. And I try and sort of look at the ways in which a certain kind of media artifact that's a document that testifies to a particular form of genocidal violence, if you will, undergoes another set of violences once it starts to enter into various kinds of other kinds of frameworks, including the framework of international humanitarian law. So I would say I use my own practice to reflect on the kinds of investigative work that we do within the context of the Center and the Forensic Architecture Project. And I think my colleague Gail Weitzman is someone who also sort of operates in that way. So it's really important for us to try and situate our practice within a variety of contexts. So of course juridical, activist, political, but also theoretical and sort of philosophical. So I think I will just leave it at that. Thank you.